Hello everyone, this is Charlie from the Bloomingdale Public Library, and today we're going to be talking about working with textures in Blender. In case you don't know what I'm talking about, Blender is a robust application for working with digital 3D objects, which you can download for free at blender.org. If you are completely unfamiliar, I already have a couple videos on the channel, or you can find a bunch more tutorials here on YouTube. In fact, Blender has an official channel if you go looking for it. So textures specifically are the 3D details that go on the surface of 3D models. So I do these courses to encourage people to create and submit original works to our 3D print program. Mostly all we see right now are things downloaded off the internet. So even though textures isn't technically a part of the 3D print process, if you're planning on printing something and painting it, this could be a very useful tool for planning your paint jobs. So, textures is a kind of big topic, so I plan on taking a very narrow, top-level approach to this course to hopefully pique your interest and encourage you to do some experimenting and research on your own. If you are interested in submitting something to our 3D print service, again, this is blender.org. This would be where you go to download the program. This is our website. It's mybpl.org. Go to the Services tab, click on 3D Printing, and we have all the details right here on our page. Incidentally, if you wanted to learn more about Blender or any other production software, like Office or any kind of coding, you can go to the Learn tab, click on Online Courses, go to LinkedIn Learning, and then click Start It. If you type in your library card number and your PIN, which should be the last 4 digits of the phone number we have on file, you'll go to a page where you can search for pretty much anything out there. So what exactly is a Blender texture? A Blender texture is a 2D image file applied to the surface of a Blender object. You might think of it as the object's skin. In fact, some people might use the term skin. Just keep in mind that a single part of this image can be used multiple times on an object. If you think of having a window on your image file, you can use that one window 20 times to cover a house. A texture is one component of a material, which can have many other properties. We'll have a look at that, and we probably won't deal with any of them. A material can include multiple textures, and an object can have multiple materials. So we're not going to be doing anything crazy like that today, but if you go searching for textures to use with your Blender objects, you can find a whole bunch of stuff on the internet. Sometimes you need a login for some of the websites, but when you download a texture, it's almost always going to be a zip file, which will include a whole bunch of textures, including color, displacement, normal, bump map, specular, etc. And for what we're talking about today, we're only really concerned with the color texture. But again, keep in mind, if you get a whole bunch of files zipped up when you go looking for textures, that's not unusual. As far as an object having multiple materials, if you think of Woody from Toy Story, if he is a single object, his face probably has a different material from his shirts and his jeans and his boots, and his head is probably its own object if everything else isn't too, but I think you get the point. Blender also includes some procedurally drawn textures, but to use a texture image, you need a UV map. And I will help make sense of that in just a bit. Okay, so let's look at our default cube a little bit. If we wanted to give it a texture, you might remember textures are a part of the material. So what we want to do is go to the property panel on the right here, and look at the little 3D sphere here. That is the Material Properties tab. Click on that. That gives us all these options here. Starting from the top, we've got our list of materials included in the object. So by default, we have a single material, and it's named material. You can double click it to give it another name if you like. Scrolling down, we've got a preview tab. If you open that up, you can get a preview of your material on various surfaces. Then we have an open surface tab. So by default, we're using nodes, and you can tell because it's highlighted blue. If I click on that, we're no longer using nodes, but we also lose a lot of our properties. To be honest, all we're really worried about today is our base color, but we do need a node input for that, and you can tell there's a node input if there's a dot on the left side. So there's no dots there, we need to use nodes, and when I do that, you'll notice pretty much all of these properties have a dot on the left side. So imagine a texture input for each one of these properties. When I said that a material can have multiple textures, I was not joking. Incidentally, I've heard that this surface node, the principled BSDF, is a Disney standard, which is probably why there are so many options here. And later in the video, if things start to slow down for you, what we can do is choose a different surface node. And I'm going to do that right now because I'm on an older library laptop. So I'm going to choose under shader the background node, and you'll notice all those properties went away except for color and strength. But like I said, all we really need is this color attribute with a node input, so we're good. So let's look at the color first. If I click on the color here, we have a color wheel. I'll choose red. This would be a good way to preview the printout color for your 3D print. You'll notice once I choose red, my cube is still gray. That is because of the viewport shading options. So those are in the upper right corner here. We start off with wireframe on the left. Next up is the default solid mode. After that comes the material preview mode, which is what I'm going to leave it on. And after that comes the rendered mode, which is another thing that will seriously slow down your computer and put some stress on your CPU, which on this laptop I can't afford. So I'm going to leave it as it is. So if you wanted to check out other colors, again, you can just move your cursor about the wheel. Compare it with what we have available on our website before you send it for a 3D print. But going from there, we're going to start looking at textures. And I mentioned that Blender includes procedural textures. And we'll have a look at one of those real quick. So I'm going to choose the checker texture under the texture column. You see when I do that, I get checkers. Unlike your typical texture, we don't have an image to play around with, but I just wanted to show this as an example. Again, we've got some options to play around with: color 1, color 2, scale. Again, not a typical texture, but it might be something you might want to look at and play around with. What we're actually worried about today is image textures. So I'm going to click on this dot, again on the left side of the color property, and under the texture heading I'm going to click on image textures, and then we'll go from there. So our cube is black because the color is set to image texture, but there's no image texture selected. So to fix that, we can either create a new image texture from within Blender, or we can open a file outside of Blender. And we'll do that first. So what I'm opening is just a file I found off the internet. If you do a search for Blender textures, a whole bunch of websites will come up. Some of them will have free stuff, others will be premium, and some will require a login. You can also create your own images outside of Blender. It's recommended that if you do, that your image be a perfect square with pixel dimensions as powers of 2, so 64 by 64, 128 by 128, etc. You can have a bitmap, JPEG, PNG, and a couple other file formats, but those are the big ones. So I opened the brick file, and now my cube has a brick texture applied. So you might recall me saying that in order to have an image texture applied to an object, that you need a UV map, and we never created one. And that is because all of the objects under the Add Mesh menu all have UV wraps built in by default. So we'll have to use a different object to practice unwrapping, but in the meantime, we'll work with what we're given. So I'm going to go to the UV editing layout, and when I do, I get this. So this is the UV editor on the left and the regular 3D viewport on the right in edit mode. So you'll also notice that they pulled us out of material preview mode there, so I'm going to go ahead and set that back. I'm just dragging the window divider like so. So in the UV editor, when we had our automatic UV wrap happen, basically all the faces of our object were laid flat. So for a cube, that works out just right, but for most objects, you're going to get a bit of distortion, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So everything that's selected on the right is displayed on the left, and you'll notice all the tools should be pretty familiar. We can still select vertices, edges, and faces, and then along the side here we've got the selection, move, rotate, resize, etc. So the only difference is now in the UV editor we're only working in 2 dimensions. So let's go ahead and grab a vertex, select the move tool, and you'll notice again we can only go in 2 dimensions. In case you're wondering, UV for UV map doesn't stand for anything. It's just the U and V are the U and V axes. The U-axis is the left and right, while the V-axis is up and down, if you can think of it as V stands for vertical. So, like I said, everything that's selected on the right shows up on the left. If I deselect everything on the right, everything disappears on the left. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, it just means we can focus on one thing at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and select the face selection mode. Click on a face, and you can see now we can focus on just that face at a time. If I hold down Shift, we can look at multiple faces at once. If you'd rather, there's also this little button up here that is sync mode, where everything will always appear, but anytime you select something on one side, it selects on the other. So there's reasons you want to use one or the other, and once you've got whatever you selected, you can use the tools to start moving things around to get your UV map creating the image that you want on your object. So that's about as far as I'm going to go with that for now. Next, we're going to look at an example where things don't do everything by themselves, nor do they unwrap quite as perfectly as a cube. Okay, so we want to do a manual UV unwrap, so we're going to need an object that doesn't have a UV map already built in. So what I'm going to do, because I'm not feeling very creative, is show you something cool. We're going to go to the Edit menu, click on Preferences, and then on this window, halfway down on the left, we have Add-ons. Add-ons extend the functionality of Blender. All of these guys are add-ons. They're already built in. All you need to do is check a box in order to enable it. So some of these are bigger and better than others, but there is something here for everybody, so I recommend having a look. If you see something that looks attractive to you, just click on the little arrow. Maybe you see a little description. If not, you can click on the documentation link, and that'll take you somewhere that will describe what an add-in is and what it does. So if, again, it sounds good to you, just check the box, and that's all you need to do to enable it. And if it turns out that it's just getting in your way or it isn't what you expect, you can come back here and uncheck it to disable it. So what I want are some extra objects here. So where it says add mesh, extra objects, I'm just going to check that box. Close it. Now when I go to add mesh, we have extra objects. So because I don't want to blow up the laptop, I'm going to pick up something relatively simple. I'm going to go for pipe joints, pipe elbow, and we're going to get that cube out of the way. So you don't need to assign a texture in order to do a UV unwrap, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and select our little elbow there. Go to the material properties. I'm not going to create a new material. I'm just going to use the old material left over from the cube. Change the surface to background. Change the color to image texture. I'm going to open another texture that I downloaded earlier. And then from where we left off last time, all we should need to do is click on Viewport Shading, Material Preview, in order to see something, but this time we do not. We just see this mucky gray skin here, and that is because we haven't done the UV unwrap. So let's do that. I'm going to click on the UV editing layout, make sure everything is selected, click on UV in the edit mode here, and do a UV unwrap. And what do we have here? Oh my. So that is ugly. If we look at how much distortion there is, we can actually do that by going to this overlays menu here. Click on the down arrow, click on display stretch, and you see it's mostly yellow and green. By contrast, if we were to look at the cube unwrap, it would be perfectly blue. There is no distortion in the cube at all. So the seams might not line up, but otherwise what you see is what you get. In this case here, pretty much everything is wickedly distorted because our little elbow here is not laying flat. In order to get it to lay flat on the UV editor, what we're going to need to do is make some cuts in the surface to help it lay flat. And I will show you how to do that. Okay, so our goal is to get the UV unwrap to lay as flat as possible. So we want to get rid of the distortion that we've got there, and we're going to use cuts to do it. It should be pretty easy. If you look at our elbow joint, it's basically two rolls of paper connected at the middle there. So if we were to cut this at the middle and cut lengthwise to open it up, that should give us two flat islands. So let's see where we're at when we just make this first long cut here. First we got to make sure we're in edge mode. Again, we're going to cut all the way across here. Going to go to edge, mark seam. You see our seam turns red once we mark it, indicating that we're going to cut the surface right along that line. And I'm going to do a UV unwrap to see where we're at. And already you can see everything is much better, much more flat. And we already have our checkerboard pattern even. But we can do better. Like I said, if we do a cut down the middle there, we should get two perfectly flat islands, which I think is preferable. And it's easy, so let's do it. Oh. Deselect everything, make sure we're in edge mode, click on an edge. This time I'm going to go to select loops, edge loop, and that should do a ring all the way around the object. So depending on your object shape, you might be able to use that tool as well. Then we'll go to edge, mark seam, select everything, and go to UV unwrap. There we go. Look at that. So now we are solid blue. Our squares all look good, except the seams don't line up. And we can fix that though. I'm going to go to island selection mode here. Select just the left side. And select the rotate tool. and just rotate it around like that. Ta-da! So obviously this was a much easier object than most, but the idea is the same. You keep making more and more seams, try to be smart about it and make as few as possible, but keep doing it until you get your object to have as flat of a UV wrap as possible with as little distortion as possible, and you should get some similar results. Next, we'll have a look at actually painting on our objects. Okay, so let's finish up by discussing how to create texture images both inside and outside of Blender. So we'll start off like we normally do. We'll go to the material properties, make sure we have a default material. For the surface node, I'm going to set it to background, again just to ease the load on my computer. Then for the color input, we're going to choose image texture. And instead of opening, we're going to choose new. When we do this, we're actually creating a new document. So keep that in mind, and you probably want to name it something. So we'll go with texture 1. We'll set the background color to white, though black is fine too. And we're ready to roll. I'm going to click on Texture Paint up at the top here to go into the Texture Paint layout. And this should look kind of familiar. So on the left side, we've got the image editor, which looks a lot like the UV editor, except you'll notice the tools and brush options at the top are all different. In the right side, we've got the 3D viewport still, but this time it is in Texture Paint mode. Let's go ahead and make sure that is in the material preview mode as well. There we go. And from here, all we gotta do is choose a color other than the background color and start painting. You'll notice as we paint, the changes are reflected in the 3D viewport. So there's a whole bunch of brush options. If I drag things around, you see we've got a whole bunch of different menus. I'll let you float through those on your own. It's very similar to the options we saw in the sculpture video. I'm going to go ahead and undo all of the numbers I just did and show you that it works the other way around too. So again, I'm going to zoom in, and as computer is stalling. There we go. And I think you get the point. So you can either paint in the image editor and see your changes reflected in the 3D viewport, or vice versa. Or if you'd rather work in another image editor, you can do that too. So what I'm going to do here is click on UV editing, click on UV, and export UV layout. So this way we'll be able to use the UV layout as a guide for our texture. So I'm going to export UV layout, minimize Blender, and open GIMP. File, open, and here is the layout that I exported. It's called cube.png. Of course, you can name it whatever you like. So this is what it looks like when I've got the UV layout in GIMP. And to use it as a guide, what I would do is create a new layer and then make sure the order puts the layout on top. So from here, we can go ahead and use GIMP to create our texture image. When you're all done, go ahead and export it. We'll name it Texture 2. Now when I go back to Blender, I'm going to go to the material properties. And I'm going to go into the folder here for the color. Instead of texture 1, I'm going to select texture 2, open image, and you can see we've got what we created in GIMP. So I know that was a pretty quick overview. Nonetheless, I hope it inspired you to learn more, and I hope you have a good day.